טוב, כל הכבוד לכם שאתם עדיין פה בשעה מאוחרת זו. אנחנו רוצים להתחיל את הסשן השלישי שלנו. אנחנו החלטנו לראות איך הוא הולך. דונה עוזבת הלילה ב3 בבוקר, אז אנחנו נראה בכל מקרה. בוא נתחיל. אני לא חושבת שיש sorry, I should speak English. So I said that we are open our third session, if you didn't realize that. Okay. So there is no need, I think, to present Ra'anan. I guess everybody knows who Ra'anan is. So I'll just take the opportunity to express our gratitude to you, Ra'anan, for being there for so many of us, for teaching, for supervising, and last not least, for really promoting the ethical and compassionate ideas in our group. And with this introduction, here you go.
Thank you, Gabi, and thank you all. Because of the abundance of and richness of what we have already heard, I decided not to do any further burdening of intellectual and conceptualized full lecture or paper, but just some remarks concerning my connection with Donna and one or two theoretical and clinical points, and then we would like to gather you. You were so polite and so listening carefully and patiently, and with the words that Donna suggested, even tenderness. The combination of even tenderness. Can we really expect tenderness among us? Yes, of course. So I think that I would like to say something about our connection, Donna. Of course, our joined love and admiration for psychoanalysis and our gratitude for self-psychology, but mainly I think the gratitude to the legacy of Emmanuel Levinas. That's why I asked Donna in 2010, when we made the international conference of the International Association in Turkey, to be together with Shlomit and Jim Fish to be on the panel when I'm going to lecture, and she discussed my paper. And what I want to tell you is that when I raised up from my chair and start to read my paper, I just on my left ear, and the question of ears is very, very relevant for Donna, on my left ear I heard a very funny noise and I couldn't figure out what was it. And when I dared to look on my left, Donna simply sat before 500 or 400 people knitting a sweater. Really? And when I asked her later for whom this sweater is going to be, she had some answer for a relative, a young relative of her. And I was all the time when I read my paper thought of Anna Freud and Erik Erikson. When Erikson was in the middle of his 20s, he was analyzed by Anna Freud, and he heard this kind of noise behind his head and didn't dare to look as I dared a bit. And when his son was born, and he was very furious of Anna Freud that she didn't mention anything about the pregnancy of his wife, but the day after the birth, at the end of the session, Anna Freud handed him over a sweater that she knitted for Kai during the sessions of Erik Erikson. So in a sense, all the time when I read my paper, I felt as if I was Erikson analyzed by Anna Freud.
You know that, oops, this is not. You know that she also knitted for Heinz Kohut's son, Thomas.
Yeah. Later on 2012, we had a very special event, seminar, which was devoted to the influence and effect of the Levinas philosophy on the future of psychoanalysis. It was a joint project of the Israel Association for Self-Psychology and the Study of Subjectivity and the Israel Psychoanalytic Society. And it was quite a remarkable memory. We dealt with various issues concerning the ethical turn in philosophy and in psychoanalysis. In 2014, Donna was attending the conference in Jerusalem. It was the 37th conference of the IAPSP, and she was one of the people who visited our compound in Lod with a very great wondering and amazing feelings towards us concerning this project. At the end, at the last lines of Coates' last paper, the semicircle of the mental health, which his son Thomas read before the Chicago Institute, he said, he wrote this: analysis is in its childhood. Psychoanalysis has hardly yet scratched the surface of the fascinating mystery of man. And how can analysis return to its nuclear self, move on to fulfill its destiny by realizing its essential program of action? It can do so only if it can make the decisive developmental step of the full transmuting internalization of the great parental self-object of its past. If it succeeds in this task, it will be able to do what it must in order to stay alive, to reach its peak before it declines. It must turn from the study of Freud to the study of man. And I think that in the same way, in the same vein, he thought of himself that psychoanalysis of the younger generation has to surpass him. Not to dismiss him and not to defy him, but to surpass him in what we are able in our collective creativity, in our collective wisdom, cultivate within psychoanalysis and within self-psychology. I would like, the only question that I would like to raise to Donna and to you concerning what I would like to say is, for me, the basic point or the major core of Donna's legacy or Donna presentation today too. The hermeneutic of trust. She defined the psychoanalytic phenomenology or self-psychology in that sense. And it's contradicting, of course, what we had been defined by Paul Ricoeur, the French philosopher, the hermeneutics of suspicion, of suspect. In Hebrew, we have three words: emun, trust, with tzere, in the aleph, emuna, and imun, with chirik, under the aleph. It's almost the same word, of course, from the same root: trust, faith, and practice. And I would like to say something about these three. I think that the main issue that I have dispute about with Donna, understanding of the human experience, is the possibility of the human being to transcend subjectivity. It's a quite radical idea. It's quite tantalizing idea, and I know that it raises in many philosophers and artists and ordinary people, and of course psychoanalysts, many objections. But this is something that we are working on and researching on in our daily practice and in our daily teaching and studying. And what I would like to say is that for me, the highest stage of subjectivity is transcending subjectivity. And this is relying on what Levinas, in his last phase of theorizing the human experience, suggested in quite an enigmatic title and of a very radical volume, Otherwise than Being Beyond Essence. And in this, even in this title, and of course in many, many elaborations within this gigantic volume, he studied the ability of the human mind to transcend its own particularity within the phenomenological experience. This is something which is a paradox or oxymoron or what you would like to define it, but the question of being able to transcend from myself, to leave myself, to be free not only from my oppressors, but to be free of myself in order to be dedicated and obliged and committed to the other. This is something which is for us here part of what we are doing in self-psychology, in the Israeli self-psychology, although not all of us are in the same attitude and thoughts about it. But this is something that we are really trying to cultivate here. The essence of being and the ability to get rid of the essentialist dimension of being means transcending being, not evading being, not abolishing it, not extinguishing it, but in somehow to use, I would say, a subtlest levels of the mind, subtlest levels of the human experience. So this is something that I would like to pose as a question to you, of course, and to enjoy the collective wisdom of you, the audience. The question of the ethical turn in philosophy, in psychoanalysis, which self-psychology is such a beloved protagonist in this process, is something that we join in our attitude and in our commitment as people and as therapists. And I would like to say that the question is, how do we educate to this ethical stance? Is ethical stance something which is natural to us? And if it's natural to us, how do we cultivate it? And can it be cultivated systematically, not only at a personal level, but at a level of systematized training, procedures and practices? This is what I mean by the third word, imun, practice. And it's very interesting that these three words are coming from the same root. Emun, trust, and imun, practice, are masculine terms. The middle term, emunah, is feminine. And I think that when the feminine, if we want to bring back the feminine into life, we have to practice. We have to return to the masculine stance of practicing. And the question is, what do we practice? I think that in self-psychology, and both in the Buddhist tradition, psychology and practices of transforming the mind, what we find as the most evocative and the most inspiring is the notion of infinite transformation, the infinite possibility of the human mind to transform itself from being entrenched in self-cherishing, in egocentric circles, to something which is much higher, manifesting its humanity and its subjectivity. So the question is, if I'm going to you phrasing, we are participating not only as observer, but as engaged participants within the experiential field, within the intersubjective field. The question is, what is this immersion, or what is this participation? And I would like to remind us perhaps one of the most inspiring sentences of a quote from the 1966 papers of Forms and Transformation, that the highest narcissistic development process that man, that human being can cultivate in himself is the transmission from particular individualistic existence to supraordinate participating existence in the world. In this word, participating, he probably meant, to my mind, the same credo that Donna is pushed by, mobilized by, in her notions of radical engagement in the field between the two. So in these remarks, I want to invite you, first of all, you, Gabi, and all of you.
Say anything?
No, you want me to? Okay.
You'll say.
First, I should say that I have not prepared for any of this. So you must forgive me if I say some things that are sort of only half thought out, because I have not prepared for these responses. There are two very large topics on the table here, and I will not be able to do justice to them. Each one would be worth a book. So first, I think we need to talk about, yes, within the hermeneutics of trust. This is very interesting that you have 3 Hebrew words for that, and that some are feminine and some are masculine. These I didn't know, of course. Certainly, I knew that Ricoeur's work is translated more often either the hermeneutics of faith or the hermeneutics of grace. I got a Marian reading of it to translate, to talk about the hermeneutics of trust. And I like it in part because Erik Erikson's work on basic trust is evoked by this as well. And also the Danish philosopher Knud Eiler Løgstrup writes of trust as the basis of the ethical relation. So and you'll find a fairly nice chapter on the relationship between Løgstrup and Levinas in the new book that I just sent away to the publisher, which should be out in about 6 months. This book is called Learning to Hear, and it's based somewhat, the metaphor is about my hearing difficulties. Learning to Hear, psychoanalysis, history, and radical ethics. But you'll see what the comparisons there. So I'm the whole thing you open up about trust, faith, and practice is very interesting to me. It would not have occurred to me that a return to practice is a return to the masculine. But since you say so, I'll take your word for it. This is. People used to tell me that I was half masculine and half feminine because I think and talk half and half, with logical capacity and also more, whatever you would call, I don't know how you would describe feminine speaking. In any case, the transcendence question for me is very complicated. I don't think it's a yes, I agree with transcendence, or no, I don't agree. I think it really depends on what you mean by transcendence. If by transcendence you're talking about, and a word that you used to use a lot, and I don't know if you still do, but some of the people who follow you use, is dissolving. Dissolving is a word that worries me a lot. I don't think the idea that we should dissolve into oneness or into some kind of unity or communion or something, and that constitutes transcendence, is something that I want to be part of. That's That reminds me of totalitarianism. And of religions that obliterate the individual and the plurality. It doesn't usually leave room for many opinions or many paths or whatever. I'm a pluralist with respect to religion, for example. I think there are many paths. I'm a pluralist with respect to psychoanalysis and psychology. I think there are many paths because there are many perspectives on whatever it is that is true. So, but I also very much accept the Levinasian idea of transcendence. And that is that we are required to transcend our narrow egoistic in self-enclosure to turn toward the other. And that there are times when he said, you know, that the face of the other is the trace of God. And sometimes he seemed to be saying that that's what he meant by transcendence. It's a change, it's an inversion of our concentration on our own subjectivity and our own ego, and a turn toward the other. And I think that that is the most central thing he meant by transcendence. He was allergic to mystical ideas. He didn't like the mystical forms of Judaism, and he criticized Martin Buber for that, for example. He was brought up in and pursued a very scholarly form of Judaism, the study of the Talmud and all of the texts, which he dearly loved. But his version of transcendence, as I read him, and of course I am not a Jewish scholar, I wish I were, has to do with getting out of my own self-involvement, being open enough that I can be called out by the other's suffering. That's what Levinasian transcendence means to me. So that's one piece of how I would say it depends on what you mean by transcendence. I'm all for it if it means what I think it means, and I'm nervous about it if it means being swallowed up in a monistic or mystical thing. That seems to me to endanger the sense that the other, for example, my patient is not part of me. My patient, even under the self-object idea, my patient is an other. And my patient may make use of me. The self-object idea is that the patient uses my psychological functions to build up a sense of self that can be more than they were before when they were trapped in whatever suffering caused them to come into my office, into my practice. But the patient does not become part of me, nor do I become part of the patient. We are two. And so my husband, who is a scholar of world religions, when I started talking with him about this in the process of writing my last book, said, you know, there are two kinds of communion. He said there's the communion where everything is absorbed into the one, and then there is the communion of the two together, where we share a common spirit, we share common ideals, we have moments of what Daniel Stern would have called moments of meeting, but we are two or three or 150 or however many of us are in this room. We are not all one. And I don't want to be one. I want us to be many. So that's there. Okay, now I'm sorry, I got on a rant. But anyway, you want to know what I think, and so I'm telling you. Okay, the other question is about the ethical turn, and it's related, of course. Your questions are related, and the answers will be related. How do we cultivate this? There's a wonderful Jewish scholar in the United States, whose name you may know, Claire Elise Katz, who writes about Jewish education and she is also a Levinas scholar, and she writes about Jewish education as the best way to cultivate an ethical spirit of the Levinasian type. And she thinks that and I, sort of in a companion spirit, have written that the study of history from the standpoint of those oppressed by history, many of you heard me say this on Friday, when we get close to when we listen to the voices, we let the people who've been oppressed teach us their history, that it educates our ethical hearing. It begins to teach us to hear things as if we were learning a new language that we didn't know before. And so, for example, when we want to get children to be more, if you will, empathic toward kids who have grown up in the ghettos or in other cultures, we help them to be close to them. We put them in classes together when they are very small, and we help them to teach each other things. And when they start to learn from each other, there are things that they learn about how they are different and what they have in common. There's a kind of ethical learning that can take place very, very young. And so I'm with Claire. I think that education of a very particular type and I think it's something we all need to be thinking about. How do we educate kids? We have to re-educate ourselves. I mean, we've all absorbed so many terrible things that we have to re-educate ourselves all the time. But how do we educate children toward the ethical turn? This is, I think, the big problem. I don't know. That's probably enough for now.
A small question. You mentioned radical ethics.
Yes.
Could you say a few words about that for those who didn't read your unpublished book yet?
Oh, sure. Traditional ethics is rationalistic. Starting with Aristotle and the virtue ethics and what virtues constitute a good human being, and Aristotle taught us that it's always in moderation, between extremes, nothing too much, nothing too little, right in the middle. You want to find the middle path. Then more Enlightenment ethics came with Immanuel Kant. And it's always rationalistic. It's always calculating in the sense that what is it that I would want everybody to do in this situation? It's got to be generalizable. So of course it also takes the form of a kind of negative golden rule. Do not do unto others what you would not have them do unto you. So keep your promise, because you want to live among human beings who keep promises, and you want to be able to count on other people to keep promises. And so promise keeping is a good thing to do, because that's what everybody should do, and so on. And don't lie, because you will create a situation and a society in which everybody lies. And this will not be good. So this is all rationalistic. Then you go to the utilitarians, and they calculate the benefits and the costs of every ethical decision. And, the greatest good of the greatest number, and you just plug it all into your computer and the right ethical decision comes out. So this is not radical ethics. All these different kinds of ethics, which are the most commonly used ones, I might add, including social ethics, and I can tell you the story of John Rawls and social ethics if you want. These are all rationalistic ethics. Radical ethics is an entirely different thing, and it kind of turns it all upside down. And it simply says, the other comes first. That's, whether it's Leuchtrup or Levinas, either version of that, simply says the other's needs come before mine. My death is not as important as yours. My suffering is not as important as yours. And it isn't that it's not important. This doesn't make me into a masochist. It doesn't mean that I wake up in the morning and say, how much can I suffer today? No, this is not the idea. And it isn't about paying for my edible guilt either. I've written about why ethics is not masochism. It's not about me. It's not about fixing my edible guilt. It's about the other. It's always about the other. And that's a radical idea.
Okay, with this statement, I think we'll open the floor because it's now about time to hear from you guys. And let's see who wants to remark or ask a question or say it in Hebrew and I will translate it, whatever is comfortable. Yes.
First of all, thank you very much for...
Somebody needs to run.
Hello.
First, I wanted to thank you, Dr. Donna Orange, and all the participants for a really inspiring evening. It was really thought-provoking and very compassionate. And first of all, I would like to ask about the clinical hospitality, because you mentioned Levinas, both of you mentioned Levinas. And we have here an example that Oli brought, an example of the complications of caring. The complications of caring, because sort of we can really see how there's the connection between hospitality and being taken hostage. Mm-hmm. In the case of Yael and taking in, was it Guy or yes, a guy, and becoming homeless after being offering him her tent and opening her door, and giving in. She's into relating to herself as an object and not as a subject, because we have here, Ra'anaan was talking about, letting go of our own subjectivity, but we need to recognize also the parts that when someone is outside herself, and she's completely dissociated from her own needs and vulnerability, and she's struggling with that, and she can only think of the other person. So there's no room for two, but there's no room for herself.
Is it okay if we take a few questions, or do you want to answer each?
I can't. My memory is not good enough to hold something like that and then to know. I would just say that yes, every one of us clinicians has this problem that you're talking about, and that it is not up to us to make Yael into an ethical person. She is trapped in something that is traumatic. And our job is to help her free herself from the traumatic repetition so that she could be there enough to be ethical in any way that we're really interested in. Being ethical is not being, I don't know how you would say this in Hebrew, is not being on autopilot. When we're automatic in our response to the other, like she was in this clinical story, this is not about ethics. This is about trouble. This is the kind of thing that brings people into our practice. And our job as clinicians is to be available enough to try to understand what is the trouble and to find emancipation from that. And what often happens is that as people become freer from whatever that trouble is, they do become turned toward the other because they've experienced it with us. And sometimes we've had to put ourselves, as we say in English, on the back burner for a long time in order to help them to get free. But they know some way what that is because they've seen us do it. The ethical is, and this is another answer to your question, the ethical is catching. It's contagious, just like evil is contagious. You know, and evil passes down through the generations, so does the ethical. And that's the hope that we can live by. Does that help a little? Is that all right? For now? I mean, it's not a complete answer by any means, but I'm acknowledging the importance of your question. Absolutely.
Okay. Ofra.
I would like to speak in Hebrew because I need to say something in Hebrew. רענן דיבר על אמון, אמונה, על אמון, אמונה ואימון. אני רציתי להגיד שבעברית יש לנו את אמון, אמונה ואימא. עכשיו, אמון ואם, יש בהם, באמונה וגם באימון יש אם. זאת אומרת, יש את הארכיטיפ של האם. אבל...
לפני שאת ממשיכה אני אתרגם, טוב?
אוקיי, רגע, עוד מילה אחת ואז תרגמי. אבל באמא יש את המילה אם. ואם זה פירושו, האמא תוכל להיות אמא. ואני חושבת שאולי, כמו שמשתמשים באימון, אפשר להשתמש בטיפול גם במושג של האמא. אם המטפל נעשה האמא שהייתה חסרה, אז זה לא צריך האמון. יש שם אימהות שהיא מטבע עולמנו, עמקי ליבנו, עמקי נשמתנו.
Okay, I just want to translate. She refers to the fact that Ra'anan mentioned emun is trust, trust? Faith. Emun is trust, emunah is faith, and imun is practice. And she also, she suggests that these words, emun, emunah, and imun, also stem from the word ima, which is mother. Okay, it's the same root of mother. And actually, she continues and says that im and ima. Im is if, so the question would be, if the mother can be a mother. That means that to trust means to actually ask if the mother can be a mother. Of course, the therapist. Okay. There is in trust always the question if the other, the therapist, the mother, maybe also the father, but maybe not, I don't know. I say this for the men here. If the mother can indeed be a mother is a question of trust. עופרה, זה נכון?
כן, מה שניסיתי להגיד, what I tried to say, that you don't have to go to the masculine. You can go to the feminine and the very feminine and the basic of feminine. This is what I tried to say.
The question of the masculinity and the masculine and the feminine elements in the universe is very, very important. And I didn't say that the masculine is more important than the feminine. No. But if you want to bring transcendence into living Earth, you have again to go into the masculine, because the existence, in its sense, in its essence, the masculine element, this is what brings us to be. And in this sense, you have to practice. You have to bring into the masculine, because without it, you can't implement the feminine within the world, within the universe.
I don't agree, but with due respect to Ra'anan, I think that the motherhood or the feminine or is even more connected to the fact of being. Being begins, at least for me and for Winnicott and for me, from the mother, not from the father. At least the archetype of the mother.
Just an association, this is what Winnicott would call Mother Earth. Yes. And it has to do with your case. That actually the beton surface she came into Earth, and in fact you are Mother Earth for her.
But I want to say another thing about what Ra'anan said and Donna Orange did not agree. I think that transcendence of the person, of the therapist or the analyst is very important, because if you stay with what your subjectivity, you stay with your subjectivity, and the patient, in fact, needs to go beyond his subjectivity, beyond his biography, because his biography is what Yael said about her mother, but you need to go to something else. So if the therapist or the analyst doesn't go out of his, or go beyond his subjectivity, the patient would not also know how to go, or know how to go with him to the subjectivity.
Donna, can you relate to that?
Did you want something from me, or did you want something more from Ra'anan?
For both of you.
Oh, okay.
But Ra'anan, I know, you I don't.
Oh, okay. See, this is the thing. This is really interesting. I was going to refer you to Winnicott, but you don't need to be referred, obviously. I don't think the oops. I didn't say anything that dangerous. I'm certainly not suggesting that I should hold on to my subjective view when the patient is asking for something different. Okay? In general, I allow my patients to lead me, and I try not to hold my own view tightly like so, but with an open hand and an open heart toward the other. That's already transcendence in my view. I'm not sure what more will be needed. That I should dissolve into some cosmic something or other, I don't think that's what that implies. I think it's an availability to meet the other, to accompany the other, to walk with the other through their pain and their suffering, to be alongside the other when they need me to walk along through whatever it is together. That's already a kind of transcendence. It means that whatever I was up to is maybe not important. Or if I think I have a brilliant interpretation to give to the patient.
No, it's okay.
Not you.
Oh.
I said Winnicott says wait.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, but if I either wait or I let go of it if it isn't what the patient needs. I just open it up, let it go. I don't, so often when I have been supervising people either in private or even in large situations like this, the trouble that the clinician is having is because they have a brilliant idea that they cannot relinquish. And if transcendence means relinquishing this tight hold on my brilliant idea, I'm all for it.
The question is again, how do we, not in kindergarten, how do we as therapists, as human beings with other one, from 8 o'clock to 10 p.m., how do we open our hand? What is the practice of cultivating the openness of our hand and hearts? Even if we are accepting this definition of transcendence, how do you open the heart of clenching, of grasping this, attaching this self-cherishing attitude, which is so natural to us too?
One way we do it is by talking about it. I can see that some people right here in this room are opening their hearts as just by us having a conversation about these things. I think we're having what Freud called the talking cure right now among us, and listening cure. Levinas would have called it speaking without reducing it to the said, saying but not putting it down to the said.
Okay, let's take, yes.
Hi. So I wanted to refer to some of the things that were said here. First of all, in respect to the masculinity and femininity. Oh, sorry. First of all, in respect to the masculinity and femininity, and that practice is masculine, and as you were saying, that you need to practice, go back to the masculine in order to reconnect to the feminine. And then she disagreed. And I'm wondering if it has to do with the fact that females in our culture are allowed to remain in this giving stance, connected to seeing the other, while boys and males are actually directed in a different direction. So in order to go back to being in the giving stance, maybe there's a need for practice, and maybe that's a difference why the masculine maybe feels the need for practice to go back to this giving stance, mothering stance, whereas the girl, then the woman who was allowed to remain there all along, doesn't necessarily feel like she needs to practice that. So that was one thing. And then the other thing that I wanted to say, about transcending subjectivity is that it seems to me that, if we look at the history, then we went from, having to be like, just a completely natural, blank screen, right? And then we realized that, wait a minute, the therapist is a person. So wait a minute, there's something going on between the two. So wait a minute, there's intersubjectivity. But then I think that the idea, at least how I understand it, the idea of transcending that is to come and say, okay, now that we know that there are two people involved, let us also make sure that while we realize our part and while we look at ourselves and know what we're contributing, we can also transcend that and be there completely for the client when they need us to be. So.
The problem is, even then, we can never be without our history, without our biases, without our race, without our language. I don't come as a blank screen at any point in the process.
Yeah, no, I agree with you, but I think that maybe that's something that we need to strive for, to be able, through recognizing all our biases, recognizing our history, recognizing what we actually bring with us, to try to be able to also put that, I think you said, on the back burner, put it aside while we are trying to be available maximally to be there for our clients.
Well, I think we're just using different words, because the phenomenologists talk about bracketing, and it's like putting it in parentheses, everything that I bring. The problem is that it's there whether it's in parentheses or not. And if I forget for 1 second that my whiteness is a problem, my belonging to the ugly Americans is a problem, and I am going to do bad stuff. Unwittingly, it is crucial that while we try to be as present and as fully present as we can for the other and with the patient, that presence is in part a presence that is shaped by a very humble awareness of how much I can never put it all aside. That I am a child of a colonialist power that has done terrible criminal things, that I speak the world's dominant language and I haven't bothered to learn yours, that I can't ever put that stuff aside as a clinician or as a human being. And a certain basic clinical humility is totally required here.
Yeah, I think I agree with you, and I think I just want to say one last word. I think that maybe that's what you're saying is that that's the ultimate way of how you are there for the client when you remember all of that.
תודה. כן, איריס.
I would like to refer to the notion of dissolving. For me, dissolving means vicarious empathy. Which means transcendence, which is based on a one-person psychology and not on a two-person psychology. And I think the terms that Levinas calls named otherwise than being or beyond essence is definitely transcendence, definitely dissolving to something which is definitely spiritual, if not mystical, if there is differences between the two. And this is referring to a kind of oneness, as we refer to it here.
I get probably the personal reason that I bring to this is that I am the child of a mother who wanted me to dissolve into her mind.
Yeah.
And for me, this is very, very dangerous.
Yeah. So, this is an abuse, like someone is mentioning here, not a dissolving.
Let them ask questions first. Yeah.
Well, I hope I can make my point. First, thank you very much, Donna, for all the 3 days. It was really inspiring, really. Just talking about ethics, I don't remember where I heard it, but as far as I know, the origin of the word ethic is hosting, הכנסת אורחים. The Greek word of the word ethic is hosting. And from my point of view, I think it's very basic when I host someone. He's before me. He comes before me. And for me, it seems it answers all the questions. Well, maybe I just cannot ignore the origin, for example, of my family, North Africa, when somebody is coming to you, so you nourish him. And I don't think my mother dissolves once our guests come to our house, but it was very obvious what she feels about everybody that is in front of her, that he would always comes before her, and she will do everything for him to feel good. And I think I take this ethics to the clinic and to life. Thank you. Yes, I did a lot.
I want to add to what Eliza said, two of the very inspiring terms coming from the relational perspective in psychoanalysis, relational home. And Donna several times mentioned another equivalent idea that resonates what you are saying now, that we are giving our mind as a home to the other. So making the home for the other, this is the practical transcendence. And you heard it from me reciting Kristeva concerning this etymological research of the Greek origins of the word ethics.
Yeah. Bob Stollerow is the one who writes about relational home, and yes, and we do kind of make a home in ourselves for the patient until they can make a home for themselves. Seems to be something right about this. Hospitality is a very important concept in Levinas and Derrida. And Derrida has written about Levinas in this and the very complicated things that come about with the idea of hospitality. And I wrote about it in my Nourishing the Inner Life of Clinicians and Humanitarians book.
I'm looking at the clock, and for me it's not just we are getting close to the ending. No, we have half an hour, but I look at it, it's like I feel like the end of a long journey since we started talking about bringing Donna to Israel, and I'm as a girl that came very young to Israel and was used to expecting my family to come and visit, and then the broken heart of my family going back to Argentina or to Europe. I'm starting feeling that kind of feeling towards you, because you were a relational home for me during all those months where we prepared the visit, and I also were very invested in reading your books, and I felt you all this year with me. And I must say that although our differences, and I'm happy about the differences, the difference has to do with very good people, very serious people looking for ways to help others, and for me that's a feast. We presenced the elections some weeks ago and some days ago, where we saw a lot of people trying to do a lot to make things worse. So we cannot spare this moment and others where we are doing so much of hard work to seek the right path for helping. And I must say that I'm self-psychologist from bottom to top, but everything that I read from you, for me, it's completely compatible. I feel you exactly where I need you in my work, in my clinical practice. So thank you very, very much, Donna, for everything. Thank you.
Ofra? Ofra is back there.
I hope I can say what I want to say in English, my poor English, and I apologize in advance that I'm going to change the direction of the discussion. I have a question I'm interested in. Okay. Maybe it's connected to the whole idea of feminine and masculine issues and the debate between these two, vectors or whatever. I very much liked the part in your article where you mentioned the outstanding women in self-psychology have become such generative leaders. And I asked myself, what did you mean, or why, or how do you understand this statement of yours? Because I felt it makes a difference between men leaders or whatever. And I thought maybe this connects to the ethical issue that feminine ethics, and it crosses the men and women, has to deal with listening to marginals and not to centrality. And maybe radical ethics means hearing the marginals and accepting the idea of standpoint. I don't know what you have to say about that. Hermeneutic of a standpoint and hermeneutic of listening to the marginals, and does it has to do with the developing of a theory, and maybe that's why you said outstanding women in self-psychology theory as a model of a generative leadership, vice versa, what? And how it connects maybe to the therapeutic situation as well.
This is a very beautiful question because you took what I said beyond what I was even thinking, and I am thankful for that. I feel that in my work over the years, I have not appreciated and thanked the women who have helped me and have inspired me very often. I've written about Freud, I've written about Kohut, I've written about Leuwald, I've written about Levinas, I've written about, as if there were no important generative women in my life, and it is simply not true. So this was one small attempt to correct for that. The other thing is that, yes, you're right. I was making a little bit of a point about women as generative leaders, although this is certainly not always so. You can remember Melanie Klein and Anna Freud with their murderous debates through all through the Second World War in the British Psychoanalytic Society that nearly destroyed British psychoanalysis for many years.
Because it was a masculine debate, or what?
Well, you could say that, but I don't know. I'm not going to say that, but you can say it. And I don't know if there is a specifically feminine form of leadership, but I think about Marian Tolkien, for example. She was a character, if any of you remember her, when she would get up at the conferences, she had this horrible voice, and she'd get up to ask a question at the microphone, and she would talk, and her voice was so awful, but she brought out the best in everybody, and she took younger people, especially women, and encouraged and supported and got them to write and so on. I was not one of her people, and it's only by accident if I had been there. People like Shelley Doctors and Jill Gardner, who are major figures now in self-psychology, were taught and helped and loved into being by Marian Tolkien. And there are a lot of us who've been supported by Anna Ornstein and Estelle Shane. I was the beneficiary of both of them. They have been generative leaders, and none of these people have cults around them. They don't have followers. They don't have groupies. They're people who set the others free to think for themselves. They support them, and then they set them free to grow and find their own path and find their own voice. That's what I call generative leadership, and and certainly many men can do it too. But I wanted to acknowledge these women because I usually don't, and I'm correcting my sins.
I want to make a remark. A few years ago, we heard the Dalai Lama, and one of the things that he said was that the next Dalai Lama should be a woman, because what the world needs today is compassion. And in this sense, I would like to ask Donna, if you have an idea whether we as self-psychologists or psychoanalysts or whatever can do something in our position to promote some compassion in the world.
I hope so. There are a lot of fantastic women sitting in this room. And I can only imagine that you are making an impact in this small country. That you must be. The compassion must be spreading around, and and whatever differences of opinion we may have in this room about various theories and ideas, compassion is not among them. This is a high priority. This characterizes self-psychology before the word was ever used, and the people often tell me, after I speak in various places, "Oh, you are a Buddhist." And I say, "Well, I never studied Buddhism." And they say, "But you act and talk like a Buddhist." And I say, well, if that's how you hear it, I'm very happy. That's a really great compliment. So that's, I think the compassion among the people that I have met here in Israel is tremendous. And I'm telling you, it spreads. I don't think we can do something, but compassion spreads just like evil spreads. So keep it up.
Asher?
Donna, first I want to thank you so much for reconnecting and for us being able to spend so much very special time with you. There's one thought I had that might soften some of the disagreement about discomfort that gets aroused in you when Ra'anן uses concepts such as dissolving or those kinds of more mystical terms. I've actually found my own voice here as opposed to where we went to school together, in that I can be comfortable with my spiritual side as a part of my being a psychoanalyst. And I remember being in our alma mater and one of our professors making some kind of ridiculous statement, which I then had to argue with in class, where he said that he wouldn't be able to refer to a religious psychotherapist because he would assume that the patient would then be influenced by the religious psychotherapist. And so that's where we came from. And the suspicion of organized religion is very, very understandable, and we have plenty of examples of that here. But I think that what happened when I came here was that, certainly under Ra'anän's inspiration, he lifted Kohut's 1966 article. And he lifted Kohut's first footnote in Analysis of the Self, where Kohut spoke about the true believer in his God as an example of the idealized self-object experience. Now, Kohut, who was against organized religion and was a self-declared atheist, was able to take Freud's suspicion of anything oceanic, which is what we're talking about, something mystical, and say, well, that was Freud's problem. That was Freud's countertransference. And to create a home here in Israel where religion does so many destructive things, for something that Kohut emphasized was an uplifting hand, and not just an outstretched hand, but an uplifting hand as being so central to the self-object. And so I think that there's something about finding our own voice that also includes us being aware of the ways in which we, because of our own stories, and you're honest about it, feel suspicious of something that may be for somebody else or for some other. I can tell you that the youth here are desperately seeking not simply a Levinas Talmudic expression of morality, but they're seeking something spiritual. And that something spiritual is an uplifting experience that I think is important that we develop here, and that maybe can, in your reaction to it, can also create a softer feeling inside of you towards that.
You know, Asher, that is very beautifully said. And I think that I wouldn't want any of you to think that I close out receptivity toward any kind of spirituality that really helps people. And I can tell you why certain kinds of things don't work for me, and why I would not want to impose them on anyone else. But you're not really talking, I hope, and I think, as I know you, about imposing anything on anyone. You're talking about wanting us to be receptive to the other's spiritual need, and I think that's something that as clinicians we must always do. What I don't and you don't want is any kind of religion that includes hatreds, and my country is full of that, and I want to beg you to, if you believe in anything that you pray to or whatever, to pray for my country. We need we need every kind of help we can get. So I'm, and I know you do too. I know you do too.
I would like to, probably many of you read it a few weeks ago. I find it very inspiring, and it somehow combine some of the threads that we have woven here this night together. One of our most beloved women leaders, Agi Mishol, she's a poet, and she was publishing her last book months ago, and in an interview she said, among other things, she said this sentence. I hope I will say it first in Hebrew. שירה היא דיבור כזה, שונה, שבו אני מצליחה להיות עד כדי כך אני, שאני נהיית אחרים. Poetry is such a thing, different, where I succeed to be so much me that I become others.
And I would like to just take the opportunity to recommend one book to you from a French philosopher, and if you don't get the exact thing down, I will write it down for Gabby so that she can give it to all of you. On Du Fourmentel. Does anyone know this name? She was about a 60-year-old French philosopher. She wrote a book called The Power of Gentleness. And about a year and a half ago, she was drowned on a French beach while trying to rescue two children. They lived and she died.
I think we are going to be compassionate to Donna and close now. I just want to mention that one concept that Donna is really advocating, and we heard about it before, is really freedom and emancipation. I thought that Orly's case was actually about freeing this patient from her fate, or from her karma, if you want to talk the other language. And on this note, I would like to remind everybody that we are about to have a holiday, which is a holiday of freedom in 5 days, and wish you all a very happy holiday. And also pray that we remain free. What can I say?